The warning came on a Tuesday. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the orbital defense platform Aurora, watching the holographic display flicker with incoming transmissions from across the galaxy. Every channel buzzed with the same message, broadcast in hundreds of languages. Some human could understand, most they could not. But the translation software worked overtime and the meaning was clear. They were coming. The Devourers, as they had been named by the first species to encounter them 3 centuries ago, were an extinction-level threat. They swept through star systems like locusts, consuming everything in their path. Planets, moons, asteroids, even stars themselves were drained of energy and matter, converted into fuel for their incomprehensible fleet. No negotiation, no mercy, no survivors. Jake watched as the galactic news feeds showed system after system going dark. The Zetharians, an ancient species with technology millennia ahead of Earth, had packed up their entire civilization into generation ships and fled toward the galactic rim. The Korvathi Union, a military powerhouse that had dominated 3 spiral arms, abandoned their fortress worlds without firing a shot. Even the enigmatic Vex, beings of pure energy who had no physical form to lose, simply vanished into higher dimensions. Every spacefaring species in the known galaxy was running. Every species except one. Lieutenant Sarah Grant approached him, her face pale but determined. She had been monitoring communications from the Galactic Council, humanity's tenuous connection to the broader interstellar community. Earth had only joined the galactic stage 50 years ago, after the discovery of faster-than-light travel. They were still considered newcomers, primitives by many standards. "The Council envoy sends their final message," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "They recommend immediate evacuation. They say we have maybe 3 months before the Devourers reach Earth's sector." Jake nodded slowly. 3 months. That was not enough time to evacuate 8 billion people, even if they had somewhere to go. The generation ships that other species used had taken decades, sometimes centuries, to build. Humanity had nothing like that. "What did Command say?" he asked. Sarah handed him a data pad. On it was a single-line message from Earth Defense Command, signed by Admiral Richard Blake himself. "We stand and fight." Jake felt something stir in his chest. It was not hope exactly. The odds were impossible, but it was something else, something that had driven humanity since the first human picked up a rock to defend their cave. It was defiance. The news spread across Earth within hours. The global population reacted in ways that surprised even the most optimistic analysts. There were no mass riots, no collapse of social order. Instead, there was a strange, quiet determination. People went to work. Factories retooled for war production. Scientists collaborated on defensive technologies. Volunteers lined up at military recruitment centers in numbers that overwhelmed the system. Dr. Helen Carter, head of the Experimental Weapons Division, worked 20-hour days in her lab beneath the Colorado Rockies. She had been developing theoretical weapons for years, concepts that seemed too dangerous or unstable to ever deploy. Now those theories were humanity's best hope. "We are not the Zetharians," she told her team during one of their brief rest periods. "We do not have their technology. We are not the Korvathi. We do not have their weapons, but we have something they do not." "What is that?" one of her junior researchers asked. Helen smiled grimly. "We have nothing to lose and nowhere to run. That makes us the most dangerous species in the galaxy." The first prototype emerged from her lab 2 weeks later. It was called the Havoc Drive, a weapon that weaponized the very fabric of space-time. It created localized tears in reality, unstable and unpredictable, but devastatingly effective. The weapon had a 90% failure rate in simulations. Helen approved it for mass production anyway. 10% chance is better than 0, she said. Meanwhile, in orbit, the defense platforms were being reinforced. Jake worked alongside engineering crews, welding armor plating and installing weapon systems that had been designed in desperation and built with whatever materials they could scavenge. The platforms were not elegant. They were brutal, functional, covered in missile pods and railgun batteries. Captain Eric Stone, commander of the warship Valiant, brought his vessel into formation with the growing fleet. There were 200 ships in total, a mixture of military cruisers, retrofitted cargo haulers, and even some civilian vessels whose owners refused to abandon Earth. It was a pathetic force compared to what other species could field, but it was what humanity had. Eric stood on his bridge, looking at the ragtag fleet. His first officer, Commander Lisa Park, stood beside him. "Think we have a chance?" she asked quietly. Eric shrugged. "Does not matter, we are here anyway." The Galactic Council sent a final transmission before they completed their evacuation of the sector. The message was directed at Admiral Blake. "You are making a mistake," the Council speaker said, their translated voice carrying a tone of pity. "The Devourers have destroyed civilizations that stood for millions of years. Your species is barely a century into space travel. This is not bravery, it is suicide." Admiral Blake, a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many wars, responded without hesitation. "Maybe you are right," he said. "Maybe we will all die. But if we do, we will die on our feet, not running with our tails between our legs. And maybe, just maybe, we will take some of them with us. That is more than you can say." The transmission ended. The Council ships jumped to faster than light, leaving humanity alone. 2 months passed in a blur of preparation. Earth transformed into a fortress. Cities built underground shelters. Orbital factories worked around the clock. Children were taught emergency protocols in schools. The global economy shifted entirely to war production. Money became meaningless. Resources were distributed based on need, not profit. It was not perfect. There were arguments, conflicts, moments of despair. But there was also unity on a scale humanity had never achieved before. Nations that had been enemies for centuries worked together. Scientists from every corner of the world collaborated without borders. The human race, for the first time in its history, had a single purpose. And then they arrived. The sensors picked them up at the edge of the solar system. The fleet was massive, blotting out the stars. Thousands of ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built. They moved with coordinated precision, a swarm that consumed everything in its path. Jake watched from the Aurora as the Devourers approached. He could see them now on the long-range scanners. They were not elegant ships. They were utilitarian, covered in what looked like organic growth, as if the vessels themselves were alive. Energy signatures pulsed through them like veins carrying blood. "All stations, this is Admiral Blake," the communication crackled through the fleet. "You all know what we are facing. You all know the odds. I will not lie to you and say this will be easy. It will not. Most of us will not survive the next few hours, but I want you to remember something. Every species in this galaxy ran from these things, every species except us. We are human. We do not run, we fight. And if we are going down, we are taking as many of these things with us as we can. Make them remember us. Make them regret they ever came to our home." The fleet erupted in acknowledgments. Jake felt his heart pounding. He looked at Sarah, who was coordinating the defense platform's targeting systems. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Always." The Devourers reached the outer planets first. Jupiter was their initial target. The sensors showed them beginning their harvesting process, massive tendrils of energy reaching out to siphon the gas giant's resources. But humanity had prepared a surprise. Hidden in Jupiter's atmosphere were dozens of nuclear mines, each one armed with enough destructive power to level a city. They detonated simultaneously. The explosions tore through the Devourer ships closest to the planet. It was not enough to stop them, but it was enough to hurt them. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Devourers experienced resistance. The swarm changed course, moving faster now, angrier. They bypassed the outer planets and headed straight for Earth. The human fleet moved to intercept at Mars' orbit. Eric Stone stood on the bridge of the Valiant, gripping the command console as the enemy fleet filled the viewscreen. "All weapons, fire at will," he ordered. The battle began. Missiles streaked through space, their trails painting lines of light against the darkness. Railguns fired hypervelocity slugs that punched through alien hulls. Energy beams lanced out from both sides, turning ships into expanding clouds of debris. The humans fought with everything they had. Ships rammed the enemy when their weapons ran dry. Pilots ejected from damaged fighters and detonated their reactors manually, taking enemy vessels with them. It was brutal, chaotic, desperate, and it was working. Not because humanity was winning. They were not. The Devourer fleet outnumbered them 100-1, but humanity was making them pay for every meter of space. Every human ship that fell took 3 or 4 enemy vessels with it. The Valiant shuddered as enemy fire raked across its hull. Alarms blared. Lisa called out damage reports, but Eric barely heard her. He was focused on the tactical display, watching the battle unfold. "We are losing port thrusters," Lisa shouted over the noise. "Hull breach on deck 7. Reactor output dropping. Reroute all power to weapons," Eric ordered. "We do not need thrusters where we are going." Lisa understood. She did not argue. She simply executed the command. The Valiant accelerated toward the largest Devourer ship, firing everything it had. It took dozens of hits, armor melting, systems failing, but it kept going. And when it reached the enemy vessel, Eric gave one final order: override reactor safeties. Full overload. The Valiant's reactor went critical. The explosion was visible from Earth, a brief new star that consumed the Valiant and the Devourer flagship both. On the Aurora, Jake watched the sacrifice. He felt the weight of it, but there was no time to mourn. The Devourers were breaking through the fleet, heading for the orbital defense platforms. "Target the lead ships," he ordered. "Everything we have." The platforms opened fire. Railguns, missiles, and Helen's experimental Havoc drives unleashed devastation. The Havoc drives, unstable as they were, created tears in space that swallowed enemy ships whole. Some of the weapons malfunctioned, exploding harmlessly, but enough worked. The enemy advance slowed, but it was not enough. The Devourers adapted, spreading their formation, targeting the platforms one by one. The Aurora took a direct hit and Jake was thrown from his feet. Lights flickered. Gravity failed for a moment before backup systems kicked in. Sarah pulled herself up from the floor, blood running from a cut on her forehead. "We lost port weapons," she said. "Hull integrity at 30%. Jake looked at the tactical display. The fleet was down to less than 50 ships. The platforms were falling one by one. Earth was minutes away from being exposed. He made a decision. "Evacuate the platform," he ordered. "Get everyone to the escape pods." Sarah stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Buying time," he said. "Go, that is an order." She hesitated, then nodded. The crew evacuated, leaving Jake alone on the Aurora. He sat at the command console, redirecting all power to the engines. The platform began to move, slowly at first, then faster, accelerating toward the densest cluster of Devourer ships. The enemy noticed too late. The Aurora, massive and damaged, slammed into their formation. Jake overloaded the reactor just as Eric had done. The explosion was even larger this time, taking out dozens of enemy vessels. On Earth, people watched the sky light up. They knew what those lights meant. They knew their defenders were dying. But they also knew that every explosion was a victory, a declaration that humanity would not go quietly. In her lab, Helen watched the battle through satellite feeds. Her hands were shaking. She had sent her weapons into battle knowing many would fail. But she also saw them working, saw them tearing through the enemy. It was not enough to win, but it was enough to matter. "We need more time," she muttered. "Just a little more time." She turned to her team. "Activate the contingency." The contingency was humanity's last desperate gamble. Deep beneath the surface of the moon, engineers had constructed a weapon unlike anything ever conceived. It was not elegant. It was barely tested, but it was powerful. The lunar cannon fired. It was not a traditional weapon. Instead, it fired a concentrated beam of energy harvested from the sun itself, focused through a series of massive lenses and amplified by experimental technology. The beam lanced through space, cutting through the Devourer fleet like a knife through paper. Dozens of ships vaporized instantly. The beam continued, carving a path of destruction through the enemy formation. It fired for 30 seconds before the strain became too much. The weapon overloaded, the lenses shattering, the moon itself cracking from the stress. But in those 30 seconds, the tide of battle changed. The Devourer fleet, for the first time in centuries, hesitated. Their advance stopped. They began to regroup, to reassess. Admiral Blake, watching from Earth's command center, saw the opening. "All remaining forces, concentrate fire on their command ships," he ordered. "Hit them while they are off balance." The surviving human ships, battered and barely functional, launched one final assault. They targeted the largest vessels, the ones that seemed to coordinate the swarm. Missiles, railgun slugs, and the last of Helen's Havoc drives converged on those targets. The command ships exploded. The Devourer swarm, suddenly leaderless, began to falter. Ships collided with each other. Formations broke apart. Confusion spread through the fleet. And then something unexpected happened. The Devourers began to retreat. It was not a rout. They did not flee in panic, but they pulled back, moving away from Earth, regrouping at the edge of the solar system. For the first time in 300 years, the Devourers had encountered prey that fought back hard enough to make them reconsider. On Earth, people watched in stunned silence. They had expected to die. They had prepared for extinction. But now, impossibly, the enemy was withdrawing. Admiral Blake sat in his command chair, hardly believing what he was seeing. Around him, his staff erupted in cheers, but he remained quiet. They had survived, but the cost had been enormous. 90% of the fleet was gone. The moon was fractured. Thousands of people had died, but they had survived. The Devourers did not leave the system entirely. They remained at the edge, watching, waiting, but they did not attack again. It was as if they were studying this strange species that refused to run, that fought with a ferocity born of desperation and defiance. Days passed, then weeks. Humanity rebuilt what it could, fortified what remained, and prepared for the next assault. But it never came. And then the transmissions started arriving. The Galactic Council, safely distant in their evacuation zones, had been monitoring the battle. What they saw stunned them. Species across the galaxy began sending messages to Earth. Some were congratulatory. Others were disbelieving. A few were angry, calling humanity reckless and foolish. But all of them were watching now. The Zetharians, who had fled without firing a shot, sent a formal diplomatic message. It was brief and to the point. You have done what we thought impossible. You have shown the Devourers that prey can bite back. We do not know if this will save you in the end, but you have earned our respect. If you survive, we will remember. Other species began to follow suit. The Corvathi Union offered military assistance, though their fleets were still far away. The enigmatic Vex reappeared from their higher dimensions, observing with newfound interest. Humanity had not won, but they had done something perhaps more important. They had shown the galaxy that the Devourers were not invincible. They had proven that resistance was possible. Helen stood on the surface of Earth, looking up at the night sky. Somewhere up there, the Devourers waited. She knew they would return eventually. But next time, humanity would be ready. And next time, they would not be alone. Admiral Blake addressed the planet in a broadcast that reached every corner of the globe. We lost many good people today, he said, his voice heavy with grief. Friends, family, brothers and sisters in arms. They gave their lives not because they thought we could win, but because they refused to give up without a fight. They showed the universe what it means to be human. We do not run. We do not hide. We stand our ground. And we will continue to stand no matter what comes next. The broadcast ended, but its message spread across the galaxy faster than light. Other species, hearing those words, began to reconsider their own retreats. If these primitive humans could stand against the Devourers, perhaps they could too. Resistance movements began to form. Species that had fled returned to their home systems, inspired by humanity's example. The galaxy, which had known only fear of the Devourers for centuries, began to feel something else. Hope. Months later, Sarah Grant, who had survived the destruction of the Aurora, stood on a newly constructed orbital platform. It was larger than the Aurora had been, more heavily armed, built with assistance from alien allies who had decided to join Earth's defense. She looked out at the fleet assembling around Earth. There were human ships, yes, but also vessels from a dozen other species. The Zetharians had sent their most advanced warships. The Corvathi contributed their legendary dreadnoughts. Even the Vex had manifested energy constructs to assist in the defense. The galaxy was coming together, and it was all because one species had been too stubborn to run. The Devourers still lurked at the edge of the system, waiting. But now they faced not just humanity, but a coalition. The swarm had expected easy prey. Instead, they found a hornet's nest. Sarah smiled as she watched the allied fleet. Jake would have loved to see this, she thought. Eric too. All of them who had sacrificed themselves to buy time. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The alert system chimed. Long-range sensors detected movement. The Devourers were advancing again, their numbers replenished, their formation tighter than before. They had learned from the first battle, but so had humanity. Sarah activated the fleet-wide communication. All ships, this is platform command. The enemy is approaching. You know what to do. Show them that we are not afraid. Show them that this is our home and we will defend it to our last breath. For Earth, for humanity, for every species that ever chose to fight instead of run. The fleet responded as one, hundreds of voices in dozens of languages, all saying the same thing. We stand. The battle began anew, but this time it was different. This time, the Devourers faced not a desperate last stand, but a coordinated defense. Alien technology combined with human ingenuity. Zetharian shield generators protected human ships. Korvathi weapons fired alongside Helen's experimental drives. Vex energy beings disrupted enemy communications. The fight was still brutal, ships still exploded, people still died, but the Allied fleet held the line. Every meter of space the Devourers gained cost them dearly. Every assault was met with overwhelming counterfire. Hours turned into days. The battle raged without pause. But slowly, inevitably, the Devourer advance stalled. Their losses mounted faster than they could replace them. The swarm, accustomed to easy victories, found itself ground down by attrition. And then, for the second time, they retreated. This time, they did not stop at the edge of the system. They jumped to faster than light, leaving the solar system entirely. The Devourers, the galaxy's apex predators, had decided that humanity's system was too costly to harvest. The Allied fleet did not pursue. They were too damaged, too depleted. But they had won. Not just a battle, but something greater. They had proven that the Devourers could be beaten. On Earth, celebrations erupted. Cities that had prepared for extinction now celebrated survival. But there was also mourning for those who had fallen, for the prices paid in blood and sacrifice. Admiral Blake stood before a memorial wall, looking at the names etched into its surface. Thousands of names, tens of thousands, each one a person who had chosen to fight. He placed his hand on the wall, feeling the cold stone beneath his palm. "You changed everything," he whispered. "You showed us what we could be. The galaxy would never be the same. The Devourers still existed, still posed a threat, but they were no longer invincible. And humanity, the species that had been too young, too primitive, too stubborn to run, had become the symbol of resistance." Other species began to study human tactics, human psychology, trying to understand what made them different. Some concluded it was desperation. Others thought it was madness, but a few understood the truth. Humanity fought because they had nowhere else to go, no backup planet, no generation ships waiting in reserve. Earth was their home, their only home, and they would defend it with everything they had. That singular focus, that absolute commitment made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Years passed. Earth rebuilt. The scars of battle faded, replaced by monuments and memorials. The alliance that had formed in desperation became formalized. The Terran Coalition, they called it, with Earth at its heart. Helen continued her research, developing new technologies, always preparing for the next threat. Sarah commanded the growing fleet, training new generations of defenders. Admiral Blake eventually retired, his legacy secure as the man who had led humanity through its darkest hour. But the memory of that first battle remained. It became legend, passed down through generations. The story of how every species fled, but humanity stood its ground. How they fought against impossible odds and survived. How they changed the course of galactic history not through superior technology or ancient wisdom, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to give up. Children across the galaxy learned about it in school. Earth became a pilgrimage site for those who wanted to understand what it meant to truly stand for something. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Devourers remembered. They remembered the species that had hurt them, the prey that had become predator. They would return someday, perhaps, but they would never again underestimate humanity. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Running was not always the answer. Sometimes survival meant standing and fighting, even when victory seemed impossible. Sometimes the greatest strength came not from having nothing to lose, but from having everything to lose and choosing to fight anyway. Humanity had shown them that. And the galaxy would never forget. On a quiet night decades after the battle, an old woman sat on a hill overlooking what had once been a battlefield. Sarah Grant, now gray-haired and weathered, looked up at the stars. Beside her sat a young officer, eager and nervous. "Were you scared?" the young officer asked. "When they came, were you afraid?" Sarah smiled, terrified, every single moment. "Then how did you do it? How did you keep fighting?" Sarah looked at the young officer, seeing in them the same determination she had felt all those years ago. "Because being scared and giving up are not the same thing," she said. "Fear is natural. It keeps you alert, keeps you focused, but giving up is a choice. And we chose not to. Every single one of us, we chose to stand. That is what made the difference." The young officer nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "Do you think they will come back?" they asked. "Maybe," Sarah said, "probably, but if they do, we will be ready. And we will stand again, because that is what we do. That is what makes us human." They sat in comfortable silence, looking up at the stars. Out there, the universe continued its endless dance. Threats still existed, dangers still lurked, but humanity had proven something fundamental about themselves. They would never run. And in that refusal, in that stubborn, magnificent defiance, lay the strength that would carry them through whatever came next. Every species fled the invasion. Only humanity stood its ground and chose to fight. And in making that choice, they had changed not just their own fate, but the fate of an entire galaxy. The end.